So we said CPI was one of the main ones we will focus on in terms of price indexes, but we're also going to look at one known as the GDP deflator. That consumer price index focused in on goods and services that consumers are typically concerned with. But the GDP deflator instead looks at the changes in prices in the GDP as a whole. So how do we find this? What are the steps for solving for the GDP deflator? Well, first we need to find the nominal GDP. Remember, we said the nominal GDP is just the value of all the goods and services that we produce within our country in this current year's prices. So we use whatever the prices are right now. Now, from there, we need to find our real GDP. So in order to find our real GDP, remember, we have to have a base year in order to use that base year's prices and then use the base year prices to find our real GDP. So we have our nominal GDP and we have our real GDP. And then once we have those two things, we can calculate the GDP deflator using the formula below. And that formula is just that our GDP deflator is equal to the nominal GDP divided by the real GDP times 100. And again, since nominal GDP is equal to real GDP in the base year, the base year's GDP deflator is going to be 100, just like it was with the CPI. And again, we said the big difference here is that the CPI is only focusing on price changes in goods and services that people like you and I typically purchase, but the GDP deflator looks at changes in prices as a whole across the entire economy because we're measuring all goods and services produced within our country. Now, one thing I want you to see is that the formula for the GDP deflator is not all that different from the formula for finding the CPI. So let's really think about it. The CPI formula said we take our current market basket value divided by our base year market basket value. So it's the current divided by the base. Well, remember, nominal GDP uses current prices, real GDP uses a base year's prices, current over base. So if you just think about it as current over base for both CPI and GDP deflator, you'll get the same idea, right? Because that's exactly what we're doing. Now, once we have our GDP deflator, again, it's just an index, it's just a number, not a percentage, not a dollar amount. What do we do with those? Well, we then calculate the inflation rate using the same percent change formula that we used with CPI. So what we do is we take our GDP deflator in year 2, and remember, year 2 is our later of the 2 years. We subtract the GDP deflator in year 1, the earlier of the 2 years we're trying to compare, and then we divide it by the GDP deflator in our year 1 multiplied by 100. And that'll give us a percentage that tells us the percent change in prices or the inflation rate. And remember, this is the percent change formula. So we're just saying we're taking the change in GDP deflator between those 2 years divided by our starting point times 100, and that gives us a percentage.